It's the OG Fact Checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. I'm going to kill two birds with one stone with this episode. I fell behind for Black History Month, so I gotta make up for lost time during Women's History Month. If there's one thing I can take away from all these episodes that I've researched and written scripts for, it's this. None of us in this country would be able to do whatever it is we do for a living without those who said, I'm willing to be a first at this thing so people after me can do it also. They might have put their lives on the line or encountered major roadblocks, but they persevered, put up with a lot of nonsense, and did the damn thing when most people counted on them to fail. The people of Finland have a term for it, which I've tattooed on my eagle. It's sisu. And according to the This Is Finland website, loosely translated, it means stoic determination, hardiness, courage, bravery, willpower, tenacity, and resilience. I think the term fits here. Imagine joining something no one wants you to be a part of because you're perceived as incapable of handling business. Many women proved during World War II that they could handle it, even though they were only considered just for the war effort. I've covered a few groundbreaking women from WW2 for the OG Fact Checker, like the Sooner Squadron, and actress Bea Arthur, who was in the Marine Corps Reserve. I've also covered women who unintentionally became firsts in combat years later, and one of them, Lori Piastua, was the first female Native American woman to die in combat, losing her life demonstrating sisu. I found more stories to tell about these women. So far, I've been focusing on women serving on land, but for this episode, I'll focus on air. Everyone knows about the Tuskegee Airmen, but did you know that they were Tuskegee women as well? And you probably know that both the Marine Corps and the Army had aviation fighter squadrons because the Air Force didn't exist yet. But did you know the women who took to the skies as well, supporting the war effort in their own way? They did it through the Women Air Force Service Pilot Program. Check out the acronym, WASP. We take so many things for granted, as though the ability for women to wear the uniform and fight in combat was always there. Believe it or not, it wasn't until the 1950s that women were allowed to serve permanently. And it wasn't until 1993 that women were allowed to serve in combat zones. Without those women, we wouldn't have those chances, which is why the title of this episode is, They Crawled So We Could Walk. I won't assume that you're a follower of my channel who has watched previous episodes on women who served. In those episodes, I provided background on the laws and executive orders that gave women the opportunity to join the military. So to do this episode properly, I will rehash certain information. Let's start with the emergency legislation that was passed when the U.S. entered World War II. Between 1941 and 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt ramped up the war effort and began tapping any resource that could be used. He signed Executive Order 8929 that mandated the transfer of the Coast Guard to the Department of the Navy, essentially putting everyone in the Coast Guard on active duty, which added 231,000 men to the ranks that were mostly sent overseas. The passage of EO 8929 created an interesting effect. With the men overseas, people were needed to take their place stateside, and that's when women were tapped on the shoulder. Public Law 772, signed in November 1942, established the U.S. Women's Army Corps, or WACs, the U.S. Naval Women's Reserve, known as the WAVES, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, the U.S. Women Air Force Service Pilots, the Military Nurse Corps, and the U.S. Coast Guard SPARs. There was a third piece of legislation Roosevelt passed before EO 8929 and Public Law 772, and I'll get into that in a minute. As much as 350,000 women volunteered, and approximately 6,500 of those women were Black and served in a segregated military, just like the men. In episode 26, Worshipping a Love Supreme on John Coltrane, I told you the story of how activist A. Philip Randolph strong-armed President Roosevelt to enact Executive Order 8802 in June 1941 that banned discrimination in the defense industries and the government, but it didn't desegregate the military. EO 8802 did open some doors that were previously closed to Blacks, but not all of them. Many Black women were blocked from roles they thought were open to them because they were open to white women. Now, I'm going to talk about the third piece of legislation that was passed prior to the ones I've just discussed, and that's the Civilian Pilot Training Act of 1939. Word across the pond was that Germany and Italy had active pilot training programs, so Roosevelt figured he had better get the U.S. ready. When the CPTA passed in 1939, it created the Civilian Pilot Training Program. Creating the CPTP opened the door for those who wanted to learn how to fly. Around $5 million was appropriated for the program in 1939 and 1940, with approval for increased funding in the following years not to exceed $7 million. All right, I gotta sidetrack a little bit because damned if I didn't find out how Black men were allowed to fly before A. Philip Randolph's power move against Roosevelt in 1941 and how the Tuskegee Airmen came about. And oh my days, what dirty business that was. And when I say dirty, I mean it was about politics and not about doing the right thing. Okay, here we go. So the CPTP was created for everyone to have a shot at flying, right? But it wasn't open to everyone. The U.S. Army Air Corps, which was the precursor to the U.S. Air Force, didn't want Blacks in their ranks, and the Roosevelt administration supported that rule. Even though Blacks have fought and died for this country since the American Revolutionary War, Blacks were noted in a 1925 Army report as being a subspecies of the human family who lacked courage and intelligence and were amoral. All the white folks in power clung to this nonsense as a reason to discriminate. On the subject of admitting Blacks into the Air Corps, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, the man responsible for the Marshall Plan that laid out how Germany was going to pay back for their sins after World War II, said now isn't the time to experiment because it would only reduce morale among the white troops. And he got support for this from the secretaries of the Navy and War, who said mixing the troops would only lead to trouble. Have I set the scene for you? Good. President Roosevelt was a Democrat, okay? I haven't mentioned Roosevelt's party in the episodes I wrote related to events surrounding World War II, but I'm mentioning it now because what I'm about to tell you is very interesting. Roosevelt was up for re-election for his third term in 1940. This was the president who enacted the New Deal and the WPA during the Great Depression, which his opponents, like the Dulles brothers, considered handouts that didn't recover the U.S. economy. His Republican opponent for the 1940 election was Wendell Willkie. Willkie was a lawyer, a World War I veteran, and a Democrat who supported Roosevelt and the New Deal. But suddenly he switched parties. Why? Because he was the CEO of an electricity provider for the Tennessee Valley, whose company's bottom line was being threatened by the New Deal. How? Under the New Deal was a plan to offer cheaper electricity and a flood control alternative to the area. Cheaper electricity would compete with Willkie's company. Plus, Willkie was pushing for the U.S. to step into the war with at least a foot, not just a toe, as Roosevelt wanted. So the Republicans thought, who better than to tap someone who's willing to undermine Roosevelt and make him sweat? Willkie, in an effort to stick it to Roosevelt, ran on a campaign against the New Deal that included a promise to desegregate the troops and open the Air Corps to blacks, and that he would consider other civil rights initiatives if elected. Why do you think he ran on this campaign? To get the black vote. Did it work? No! Roosevelt won the popular and electoral votes. Here's the weird part. After the election, Willkie and Roosevelt became bosom buddies. Willkie supported Roosevelt's Lend-Lease Act and championed for more aid to Great Britain. Though the ploy didn't work for Willkie, it did force Roosevelt to keep the promises he made to get the black vote. He gave the go-ahead to allow blacks to be enlisted as aviators and other modest civil rights concessions aimed at keeping the black vote. A few days before Roosevelt took the oath for his third term in January 1941, it was announced that an all-black fighter pilot unit would be trained at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington. Now you understand why A. Philip Randolph had to remind Roosevelt about the promises he made to get the black vote, and why Randolph was willing to march on Washington to make sure those promises were kept. In March 1941, the 99th Fighter Squadron was established and activated. I would love to talk about how people of the Caucasian persuasion lost their minds when the squadron became active and threatened a race riot. But I want to keep the focus on the ladies. The experiences of women in the military from World War I and afterwards differed because of race. I know what you're thinking. No! Say it ain't so! Let me line it up for you. There were 2 nurse corps established for women to join before World War I, the Army Nurse Corps in 1908 and the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. Up until 1918, only white women could join these corps. Approximately 21,000 white women had served as nurses during World War I, and when the war ended, they were allowed to stay for the Army School of Nursing that was established in 1918. By 1920, white women could achieve rank of officer, but they weren't commissioned permanently until 1947. But for black women, out of the 1,800 who were qualified to join the ANC, only 18 were allowed in the Corps for only 8 months at the end of World War I. Then they were discharged in 1919 and blocked from joining until 1941. When the U.S. entered World War II, 6,000 white women were active in the Nurse Corps by 1941. But when black women tried to join, they were still discriminated against, even though the ban was lifted. For 2 years, thousands of black women tried to join, and they communicated their frustration to Mabel Stoppers, Executive Secretary of the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. Stoppers and other black leaders put the pressure on the Army, and the Army relented, allowing a max of 56 recruits by March 1943. Their justification for this low number was that the black nurses would only be allowed to treat black soldiers in black hospital wards, so there was no need for them. But when the Army received more pressure, the limit was raised to 160, and then the Army lifted limits entirely in 1944. But by that time, 36,000 white nurses were active. Even with the limits lifted, black women were still discriminated against. By the end of the war, around 500 black nurses had served in the ANC, compared to roughly 59,000 white nurses. The creation of the Tuskegee Airmen was a mixed bag for black women trying to join the military. On the one hand, a segregated army meant black women were needed for support roles at the Kennedy Airfield in Tuskegee, especially as nurses. As many as 41 Black nurses recruited for the ANC were assigned to Tuskegee since men were not allowed to join as nurses and the squadrons were all Black. Did you hear what I just said? Men were barred from joining the military as nurses, and that ban wasn't lifted until 1955. How's that for irony? WACs were assigned there as well, like Sergeant Amelia Jones, who provided admin support to the leader of the 99th Fighter Squadron, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis. Here's what I mean when I say Tuskegee was a mixed bag for Black women. Under the Civilian Pilot Training Program, approximately 1,000 Black men were trained as pilots who got the opportunity to fly bombers on patrol and attack missions and were highly decorated for their service. Had it not been for the Tuskegee Airmen, Black women wouldn't have had the chance to be part of those historic squadrons. The CPTP also opened the door to white women who were admitted in a 1-to-10 ratio to men between 1939 and 1940 to what became the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. Because of discrimination, Black women like Mildred Hemmons Carter, who was the first woman to earn a pilot's license through the Tuskegee Institute, and Willa Brown, who ran the Coffee School of Aeronautics with her husband and organized the Civil Air Patrol Squadron 613, were rejected by WASP. There's no exact number of how many Black women applied, but there's evidence that at least 6 applied and were rejected. Now, here's another bit of irony, and this one really stings. The WASPs were a DEI flying unit. There were 2 Asian Americans, Hazel Yang Lee and Margaret Maggie Gee. There were 2 Hispanics, Frances Diaz Gustafson and Vernita Rodriguez McLean. And there was 1 Native American woman, Ola Mildred Rexroth. You may well ask, how did this come to be? Well, to give you the answer, I have to tell the story of how the WASPs came to be. Picture it! The year is 1941, and Jacqueline Cochran, a licensed commercial and transport pilot who set speed records, threw her well-earned weight around and twisted the arm of the General of the Army Corps, Henry Arnold, to allow her to choose 27 licensed women pilots to ferry military aircraft in Great Britain for the Air Transport Auxiliary, filling in the gap for the men who had to fly in combat. Cochran thinks, I know a lot of women who want to fly and who want to serve. You don't want us in combat? That's fine. But we can be useful flying assets, and I've already proven that we're capable. So, Cochran, who would become the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound, petitioned hard for an all-women flying corps, originally called the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. The squadron was commanded by Nancy Harkness Love, the first female pilot in the Army Air Forces, who had also petitioned alongside Cochran for women to fly in non-combat roles. To answer the question I posed earlier as to how the WASPs managed to be diverse with 2 Asian Americans, 2 Hispanics, and 1 Native American while blocking Black women from joining, well, Cochran felt that women flying planes for the Army took a lot of convincing. And you have to pick and choose your battles, I guess. If she pushed for Black women to be admitted, she'd be pushing her luck. With that being said, Black women did make advances in other branches of the military. They weren't blocked from achieving a first in everything, so rest easy on that. I'll cover those women in future episodes. Getting back to the WASPs, Nancy Harkness Love recruited 27 women pilots who met the requirements of having earned a high school diploma, held a commercial pilot's license, and performed a minimum of 500 hours of flight time. Once they completed their flight checks, these pilots flew aircrafts from the manufacturer to military bases and demarcation depots. In conjunction with the ferrying squadron was the Women's Ferrying Training Detachment, ran by Cochrane. This detachment recruited women pilots who had at least 35 hours of flight time to be sent to a 23-week flight training program. And after the first class graduated in December 1942, General Arnold combined the ferrying squadron with the training detachment to form WASP, with Cochrane as director and Love in charge of the squadron. Cochrane was instrumental in the presentation of the WASPs to the world, right down to the uniforms the women wore that would allow them to pin their silver WASP wings for display. Guess who designed the uniforms? Department store Bergdorf Goodman. Ladies, we have here the WASP blue dress uniform. This model is wearing a double-breasted long jacket with pockets on the chest and at the hip, with a white Oxford button-down shirt, navy blue tie, and jacket belt with dress skirt. This look is topped off with a saucy beret with insignia. Notice the military look of the uniform without it actually being a military uniform. This is because the WASPs weren't part of the military, they were civilians. The fabric is light but sturdy in the color of Santiago blue, with official patch on the upper left sleeve, giving that look of authority and putting all the men on notice that respect is due. Overall, 1,074 women graduated from the WASP training program. Up until the WASPs were disbanded in 1944, women pilots flew over 60 million miles and delivered 12,650 aircraft, representing 78 different types. They flew all the planes in the Army Air Force fleet, including the P-51 Mustangs, 4-engine B-17s, and B-29 bombers. They participated in test flights like the one for the first military jet, the Bell YP-59, performed by the first woman to do it, Ann Carl. They transported cargo and military personnel, did test flights for repaired planes, and were flight instructors. But it wasn't always flowers and sunshine for the WASPs. They faced sexism. Their knowledge and ability were always questioned. It didn't matter that 38 women lost their lives in the line of duty, 27 of them during a flight action. Hazel Ying Lee, one of the 2 Asian American women admitted into the WASPs, was one of the 27. But they looked out for each other, knowing they weren't welcome. They sometimes had to take a collection to bury a fellow WASP. When the war ended, there was talk about absorbing the WASPs into the Army Air Corps, and U.S. Representative John Costello put forth H.R. 4219, a bill to provide for the appointment of female pilots and aviation cadets in the Air Forces of the Army in March 1944. The bill failed in the House 188 to 161. General Arnold tried to do the right thing and offered the WASPs the rank of second lieutenant. But male pilots pushed back, claiming the WASPs received preferential treatment to their male counterparts. Like the WAC and the Waves, WASPs were the subject of the negative media campaign. Before the program was shut down for good, General Arnold wrote, "They have accomplished far more than the safe and efficient delivery of hundreds of vitally needed aircraft. They have proved beyond all doubt that in times of national emergency, America can give its women the most challenging assignments with complete confidence." Once the WASPs were disbanded, there was little talk of who they were and what they did until 1977, when President Jimmy Carter signed Public Law 95 TAC 202, which granted them retroactive veteran status, thanks to a committee that included Senator Barry Goldwater. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed S. 614, which awarded the WASPs the Congressional Gold Medal. And that is why the title of this episode is They Crawled So We Could Walk. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.